Hey, so in this video, we're going to cover the electron transport chain, which is the last stage of cellular respiration. So in my other two videos, I went over glycolysis and the decarboxylation steps, and we are finally going to finish cell respiration of glucose by going over the electron transport chain. So in the electron transport chain, as the name suggests, there's going to be electrons and they're going to be transported in a chain. So those electrons that we collected throughout glycolysis and decarboxylation, remember those electrons were collected and are stored or kind of held by NADH and FADH2. So NADH and FADH2, they bring those electrons and they dump their electrons into the electron transport chain. NADH is going to give its electrons to complex number 1, which is a very large protein, and FADH2 is going to dump its electrons onto complex number 2. By the way, this is all happening on the inner membrane of the mitochondria. If this is a prokaryotic cell, since they don't have mitochondria, this is just happening on the cell membrane. So after dumping their electrons, the molecule called ubiquinone, also known as Q, is going to carry those electrons to complex number 3. And then cytochrome C is going to carry those electrons to complex number 4. So there's just 4 complexes, and these electrons are going through them in a chain. Now, while this is happening, number 1, 3, and 4 are going to be using the energy from those electrons to pump hydrogens through the membrane into the intermembrane space of the mitochondria. And we'll talk about what that does in a second, but just know that hydrogens are being pushed in one direction. And at the very end, these electrons are now very low energy, so we call them low energy electrons. Now they have to go somewhere. They can't just stay in the membrane. And so what happens is hydrogen and oxygen are going to come and pick up those electrons, combine to make water. Now, notice that I have put oxygen in bold here. The reason why is because oxygen is extremely important for the electron transport chain. And actually, this is why the entire process is called cellular respiration, because we need oxygen to perform the electron transport chain. And then in the previous step, during decarboxylation, we get rid of carbon dioxide. So that's kind of like respiration. We breathe in oxygen and we use it for this, and we exhale or breathe out carbon dioxide. So that is why this whole process is called cell respiration. Okay, so now that we've got all of these hydrogens pushed to one side, they're going to want to go back down their concentration gradient and go into the matrix. So all of the hydrogens are up here. They want to go down here. And they're going to go through this protein called ATP synthase, also known as ATP synthetase. They're basically the same name, but the hydrogen ions are going to go through this transport protein into the mitochondrial matrix. And remember, because there's tons of hydrogens up here and very low concentration of hydrogens down here, they're going to be moving from high to low concentration. This is facilitated diffusion. This does not require energy. But the movement of the hydrogen ions into the mitochondrial matrix, that movement is what generates the production of ATP. So it's very similar to how a windmill works. So, you know, the wind turns the windmill, and the movement of the windmill itself is what generates energy. In this specific case, we're going to be generating ATP. And by the way, ATP synthase is also on the inner membrane of the mitochondria. So if we were to put this all together, this is what it looks like. So again, energy from those electrons traveling through the electron transport chain is forcing hydrogens up into the intermembrane space. Those hydrogens want to flow back into the matrix, and they're going to flow back through ATP synthase, which generates tons of ATP. Now, one thing I wanted to mention is that this generation of ATP is through a process called oxidative phosphorylation, which is different from substrate level phosphorylation. So here, there is no enzyme binding to a substrate and a phosphate being transferred from one molecule to another. What happens here is ADP and a free-floating phosphate, they're going to be combined through the ATP, using ATP synthase as the protein that kind of facilitates it. But it is not the same as substrate level phosphorylation, where we have a substrate and it has a phosphate and that phosphate gets transferred. And so that's kind of the key difference here. Another thing I wanted to mention is that the generation of ATP here is a lot more than numerically, there are more ATPs being made through this process than in glycolysis or through the citric acid cycle. So most of the ATP being made in cell respiration happens right here. By the way, here is a diagram of a mitochondria in case you were wondering where everything is happening. So mitochondria have an outer membrane, and then their inner membrane is all of this. And everything here is happening in the inner membrane. The hydrogens are being pumped into the intermembrane space, which is kind of the space between the outer and inner membrane. And then the hydrogens flow back into the matrix, which is the kind of teal colored area in there. So yeah, that is the electron transport chain. And by the way, again, in prokaryotes, this is all going to be happening on the cell membrane, so they don't really have a mitochondria. And again, remember that this whole process requires oxygen, which is another reason why we call this oxidative phosphorylation. So we have now completed cell respiration. So as you can see, we talked about glycolysis, decarboxylation, and in this video, we went over electron transport chain. And down here, you can really see how much energy is being made. In the electron transport chain, we make much more ATP than in decarboxylation or glycolysis. But glycolysis and decarboxylation are still important because the NADH and FADH2 that is generated is what fuels the electron transport chain. So they all kind of combine, and that's all of them. So I hope this was helpful, and I will see you in the next video.